This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry, Dr. Carpenter, can you still hear me?
I can hear you well.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, everyone, so it's noon and we're going to get started. Thanks for joining us today. We're really excited to hear from Dr. Carpenter about volatile PCBs. Before that, just a little housekeeping. You should have an option for a chat box on your Zoom window, and we're going to use that to gather the questions that we'll share with Dr. Carpenter at the end. So just look for that option, and then we'll unmute people too, so you'll have the option of speaking in for questions. Okay. So before we start, I just wanted to say a few words about our sponsor, the Northwest Toxic Communities Coalition, which is an umbrella organization that supports nonprofit groups from across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska that address local hazardous substances and environmental health issues. It works to provide relevant information and resources to its members through events such as the webinar that you're going to hear today. The University of Washington Superfund Research Program is my employer and is part of a national network of interdisciplinary programs supported by the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences to conduct and communicate research on the impacts of contaminants on human and ecological health. We are delighted today to have Dr. David Carpenter speak to us about volatile PCBs. Dr. Carpenter is a public health physician, professor, researcher, and author. He currently directs the Institute for Health and the Environment, a collaborating center of the World Health Organization. And he's also a professor of environmental health sciences at University of Albany School of Public Health. Dr. Carpenter received his medical training at Harvard Medical School. Since then, he's published more than 435 peer-reviewed papers, 6 books, and numerous other book reviews and chapters. He's also served as co-editor of the journal Environmental Pollution. His public health research is often community engaged and focused largely on the neurotoxicity of metals like lead and mercury, as well as on PCBs. Carpenter has testified against PCB makers in court and made media appearances on outlets such as 60 Minutes to talk about their dangers. It was my great pleasure to hear Dr. Carpenter talk about his work last spring at the symposium of the NWTCC. It really changed the way I think about PCB exposure and human health, and so I can't wait to hear the talk that he's going to give to us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you, and thanks very much for the invitation. Let's proceed with the slideshow. I'm going to talk today about studies that my colleagues and I have done on PCBs and their health effects. And one of the major conclusions is that inhalation of PCBs is a much greater route of exposure than we had anticipated. Now, if I can move my slides. So what are PCBs? Well, PCBs were a man-made oil that had many good uses. At the time, nobody realized how dangerous they were. And because of their chemical structure, many of them are quite persistent, both in the environment and in the human body. This is a structure of PCBs. It's a biphenyl ring that has 10 sites around the ring that either contain hydrogen if it's biphenyl or contain various numbers of chlorines if they're PCBs. Now, it's important to recognize that there are 209 different possible combinations depending on how many chlorines and where they're located around the ring. One of the insights that has become very apparent in recent years is that—
Excuse me, David?
Yes.
I'm sorry, we're just getting a lot of notice that people are hearing an echo, so I wonder if you can try muting your computer and see if that fixes the problem.
I think it's coming from the phone.
It may be your computer is trying to record your voice along with a phone. Are you there? The other thing you could try would be just speaking into the speaker instead of having it on speakerphone. I mean, actually holding the handset. David, can you— I think we may have lost you completely now.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello?
Now we can hear you. Hey. That's a lot better, it sounds like, from this end.
Okay, well, let me try again, but I think you're going to get the, let me try one other thing. I'm not sure what to do.
Maybe try just talking into your handset and not using a speakerphone, see if that helps.
Is this any better? No, I can hear the—
Yeah, that's a lot of feedback. I'm not sure what to say just because we didn't get it to work through the computer when we tried before.
There should be a volume control if I could find it.
So so your computer is muted and you're just talking into the phone. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure that I have— here, let's try. Now the computer is muted. but the phone is what's giving the feedback.
Can you hold the handset? Can you just hold the handset instead of being on speakerphone?
Well, my speaker is on, but as long as I'm on the phone, I get the feedback.
Well, I think if you hold the handset of the phone, that may help instead of using speakerphone.
Let me mute my phone and see if you hear me.
What about trying FX? Someone on the webinar suggested trying FX on your computer to mute the speaker.
I guess you can't hear me when I have my phone muted.
Oh yeah, no. Okay, so we can still hear you now.
Yeah.
Can you pick up the handset? Is that still giving feedback?
I don't have my headphone on. Hang on a sec. Sorry, a student borrowed it and didn't return it. I'm not sure what to do.
So it's fine to just go on as you have. I think we try to suggest some things that might help, but we have some comments that it's okay with the echo. We can just proceed.
Well, I'm sorry. I guess I just have to do that. All right, so let's proceed. So PCBs are found primarily in fat because they're lipophilic chemicals. So in the rivers, they deposit in sediments, they then bioaccumulate in the food supply. And over time, we have PCBs in just about all animal fats. That means your Big Mac, your chicken, your whole milk, your butter. PCBs are, all of us are exposed to them all of the time. Now, there really are three routes of exposure. You can eat them, you can breathe them, or you can absorb them through the skin. Traditionally, people have thought that the major route of exposure was ingestion, and it probably is the most important route for most people. But breathing PCBs in is also very important in certain circumstances. You can absorb them through the skin, but that's not likely to be very important for most people. The polar regions of the Earth have very high concentrations of PCBs, even though there are a few local sources. And this is because air currents transport the vapor phase PCBs to the cold regions where they come out of the vapor phase and then bioconcentrate in fish and animals. But other studies have shown that the PCBs in the air level near contaminated sites are also elevated, and therefore local residents can be exposed through that route. So PCBs in indoor air are probably even a more serious route of exposure if there's an indoor source, because you're indoors a lot of the time and PCBs would rather be absorbed through your lungs than just being in the air. There is no evidence for a safe level of PCBs. Like lead, any amount of PCBs poses risk. They have no beneficial effects, and so any exposure is dangerous. Now, the half-life of PCBs in the body varies quite dramatically with the PCB structure. The more chlorines, the less easily they are metabolized in the body or in the environment. Therefore, PCBs with large numbers of chlorines tend to be very persistent, while PCBs with only a few chlorines are relatively rapidly metabolized by the liver. But how dangerous the PCB exposure is not necessarily related to how long they stay in the body, especially if inhalation is a route of exposure that's important because we all breathe 24/7, 365 days a year. Now, this next table shows the vapor pressure, water solubility, and evaporation rate of PCBs depending on how many chlorines they have. And what you notice is monochloral, that means with one chlorine. These are relatively water soluble and they're relatively high vapor pressure. And so they evaporate quite readily. Whereas if you have 10 chlorines at the bottom of this table, they're very water insoluble and their evaporation rate is very low. This is a study that we did here with pure Aerochlor 1260, one of the commercial mixtures that Monsanto made. It's a relatively highly chlorinated mixture where 60% of the weight is chlorine. If you blow air across it, what you see is a sudden appearance of congeners that are not even apparent in the mixture. I should have said that from left to right, we go from lower chlorine to higher chlorines. And so when you blow air over Aerochlor 1260, you suddenly see a whole variety of PCB congeners that only have a few chlorines. And the pattern is very different than the parent mixture. Now I want to talk about two types of studies. First, I want to quickly talk about some studies we've done that are ecologic studies where we've looked at diseases people are hospitalized for if they live near to a hazardous waste site in New York State that is known to contain PCBs. These are hypothesis generating studies because we don't have any individual level exposure data. But these studies have led to hypotheses that we have tested then in better controlled, smaller population studies where we can directly measure exposure of personal, medical, and clinical chemistry information. So our health data comes from this New York State Sparks data. It's if you go into the hospital as an inpatient, any state-regulated hospital, which is everything except the VA and Indian Health Service clinics, when you're discharged, that hospital must report to the state health department every disease you were diagnosed with, up to 15 different diseases, including the primary cause of diagnosis, but other diseases as well. Now, obviously, socioeconomic status is a very important variable. We've obtained median family income from the census, and we also have obtained some behavioral information from the behavioral risk factor surveillance system because things like smoking and exercise and diet are important variables as well. But we recognize that these are still ecologic studies. Here's a map of New York State where we have drawn in different colors zip codes that contain hazardous waste sites. The New York State has both the National Priority List sites and state Superfund sites, and we have about 820 of them. The number varies year by year, but those that are in red contain persistent organic pollutants. Most of them are PCBs. Those in blue are hazardous waste sites that have other contaminants, metals, volatile organics, radiation, that sort of thing. Or zip codes that are not colored, don't have any identified hazardous waste sites. So what we've done is match the hospitalization data to the residence of individuals that live in waste sites that either contain PCBs, they have a waste site that contains other things but not PCBs, or they have no hazardous waste site. Now do note the long red line on the right end of this plot, that's the Hudson River, which thanks to General Electric Corporation has contaminated all 200 miles of the Hudson River from northern New York down to Manhattan. Now, one of the reasons we focused on the Hudson is because it's a pretty river. I've described it as a beautiful hazardous waste site, but the next slide shows that there are fewer poor people living along the Hudson River and those zip codes abutting the river, and there are more rich people. Furthermore, using the BRFIS data set, there are fewer smokers that live along the Hudson River, more never smokers, and people living in the Hudson in general are more physically active and they eat more fruits and vegetables. So these are the traditional risk factors for diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. What we did was look at hospitalization for cardiovascular disease relative to people living in zip codes that had no hazardous waste site. And we found that an odds ratio of 1.15 statistically significant of greater hospitalization for coronary heart disease if you lived in a PCB containing waste site. But if you lived along the Hudson River, where income is higher, there's less smoking, there's more good diet, it's even higher, 36, 1.36 odds ratio and highly statistically significant. And the same relations apply for cardiovascular disease. We looked at hypertension. Hypertension is rarely considered to be an environmentally induced disease, but we see the same thing, that the PCB waste sites have a significantly elevated hypertension. In this case, other waste sites also have significant elevations, and so does the Hudson. And then diabetes, the other disease I want to talk about. The same kind of pattern, elevated in PCB zip codes around the state, but even higher elevation for individuals living along the Hudson River. Okay, so those suggest that there may be associations with cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes with PCB exposure. How can we test those hypotheses in other populations? Well, we've done a lot of work in Anniston, Alabama. Anniston is the home of one of the two U.S. plants that were operated by Monsanto that manufactured PCBs up into 1976. And because the ecologic studies suggested an association between PCBs and hypertension, we, as part of the Anniston Health Consortium in a project funded by ATSDR, our priority was cardiovascular disease and hypertension. We did a study where we obtained blood pressure measurements in 772 residents. We took 3 blood pressure measurements. We got clinical chemistries with serum PCBs and pesticide levels, those analyses done by CDC. The amount of PCBs that are still at Anniston are really quite incredible. They manufactured some 400,000 metric tons of PCBs. There's still over almost 4,500 tons in landfills there, and a minimum of 24 metric tons were emitted to the atmosphere in that period of time. My colleague Mark Hermanson has actually measured PCBs in tree bark there. It's a good passive monitor for vapor phase PCBs, and he's demonstrated elevations in PCB levels in tree bark up to 3 miles away from the landfills. Now, if the trees are accumulating PCBs that far away, then people are certainly going to be breathing them in as well. This is a plot of systolic blood pressure in red and diastolic blood pressure in black in this population. The dashed lines show the boundaries between systolic and diastolic hypertension. Several things are apparent. There is a tendency for blood pressure to be higher with the log of the total PCB concentration, and that even within what would be considered the normal level of blood pressure, the higher the PCBs, the higher the blood pressure. We reported PCBs both as wet weight in the middle column and lipid adjusted in the right column. And what you see, if we look at clinical hypertension, there's by tertile a 4-fold elevation of risk of clinical hypertension. If we look for both systolic and diastolic hypertension, there's a greater than 5-fold elevated risk of hypertension if you have a high PCB level. Now, if you plot those as parameter estimates, what we found is that the PCB concentration was a better predictor of hypertension than was BMI, was serum lipids, was sex, was race, smoking, or exercise. Remarkably high risks. Now, in addition, these are plots by tertile. What you see is that there's not that much difference between the second and the third tertile. which suggests that this is a low dose effect of PCBs on blood pressure, which may explain why it has not been detected in other studies, because people were using background populations that already had maximal effects of PCBs on blood pressure. Now, interestingly, we found no effect of pesticides on blood pressure, and we measured most of the chlorinated pesticides. Okay, what about cardiovascular disease? Well, we also took measurements of serum lipids in this Anderson population. We found a clear association. The higher the PCB level, the higher the levels of both total cholesterol and triglycerides. And this may be the association with cardiovascular disease. I won't present the data, but in our Native American population, we did demonstrate the similar association with elevations in cholesterol and triglycerides, but we could not demonstrate a direct effect of PCBs on cardiovascular disease except through the elevations of serum lipids, which are, of course, one of the major risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Well, let's move on. We've worked for a number of years with the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation in northern New York State and southern Canada. It's a community of now about 12,000 people. They live along the St. Lawrence River, just downstream from 3 aluminum foundry plants that use PCBs as hydraulic fluids. The General Motors plant was a National Priority List site. The Reynolds and Metals plants were state Superfund sites. We studied diabetes in this population. Now, diabetes is usually, again, thought to be a lifestyle disease resulting from poor diet, obesity, and lack of exercise. And no one's going to deny that that's important, but it also, our ecologic studies and other people's results suggest that environmental factors may be important as well. So in 2007, we did an initial study where we demonstrated that there was an odds ratio of 3.9 for total PCBs and diabetes. In this, we also found a positive association for some of the pesticides. We went back and revisited this situation with another doctoral student, Zafar Aminoff, and I'm showing some of his results here. This slide shows PCB concentrations by age and BMI. There's a high incidence of obesity in this population. What you see is that the PCB concentrations don't vary that much with levels of obesity, but they vary dramatically with age. That's understandable because, first of all, most of us are exposed to PCBs at a more rapid rate than what we can metabolize them. And also, older people were around at a time when the PCB concentrations were much higher than they are now. The Mohawks are a traditional fish-eating population, and the fish of the St. Lawrence River and its tributaries were certainly contaminated with PCBs. This is the prevalence of diabetes as a function of age and obesity. You see the super obese people didn't have an excessive rate of diabetes. They certainly had more than the underweight people, but there wasn't this very striking association with obesity that one would be led to believe from the literature. However, if you look at the prevalence of diabetes by quartiles of serum PCBs, you see this dramatic association. The higher the PCB levels, whether you're in the middle or the older age range, the greater the risk of diabetes. Now, the question is, of course, these fat-soluble chemicals all migrate together. And so when you take a blood sample, you determine the PCBs, there are pesticides in that sample, and as I've already said, there are multiple PCB congeners. So the question is, which of all these chemicals that are in that blood sample are the ones responsible for the elevated risk of diabetes that we're seeing? So in this study, we used 3 different models to try to answer that question. Now, there's some dangers in doing this, and we addressed those quite extensively in our publications. But in our first model, we only adjusted for age, sex, BMI, and total serum lipids. And we found odds ratios that were significant both for PCBs and for total pesticides. Then in our second model, we adjusted the PCB results for the pesticides and the pesticide results for the PCBs. We still found significant elevations for the pesticides, but the PCB results actually were not significant there. And then finally, we used a model where we adjusted for individual pesticides in different groups of PCBs, depending on their level of chlorination and where the chlorines were around the biphenyl ring. And this led to quite different results. So what I'm showing now is the risk ratio for PCB congeners that have no more than 4 chlorines. And that led to a significant risk ratio of 5, greater than 5. But for those PCBs that contain more chlorines, there was no significant association. For DDE and Myrex that had both shown positive associations when we looked at them alone, there's no significant association. For hexachlorobenzene, HCB, there was a significant association, but it was much less than that for the lower chlorinated PCBs. Well, then the question is this a dioxin-like effect or not? So what we did was look at ortho-substituted PCBs. Our PCB analysis did not get the true coplanars. But if we looked at all non or mono ortho congeners, we found a risk ratio of 4.6 that was very significant. But if we then looked at the TEQs from those dioxin-like congeners, there was no significant association. And if we looked only at the non-dioxin-like congeners, there was a risk ratio of 5, highly significant. So what does this imply? Well, this implies that the risk of diabetes is because of exposure to lower chlorinated PCBs. These are the ones that are not very persistent and where the major route of exposure is inhalation. You can certainly be exposed to lower chlorinated PCBs to some degree by ingestion, but they don't accumulate. They're more rapidly metabolized in fish, just as they are in people. So we do not think that ingestion is the major route of exposure. So we've gone on now in recently doing another study that's led to the same conclusion that vapor phase PCBs are very important. This is looking at menstrual irregularity, studied menstrual cycles and ovulation in 215 young Mohawk women of reproductive age. We find that the lower chlorinated PCBs, but not the higher chlorinated PCBs, nor the 3 pesticides that we measure, alter menstrual cycles. And at the highest concentration, these women simply do not ovulate. And this is shown in this plot in studies that were published just 2 years ago, where the probability of not ovulating is directly related to the concentration of these mono-ortho PCBs, most of which are low chlorinated. And then in a study just published last year, we've looked at the FSH, the FSH-LH ratio. A high FSH-LH ratio impairs ovary function. And you can see that it shows clearly that the higher the concentration of these monoortho PCBs, the greater the risk of not ovulating. So I think the significance of these results is that not all PCBs or congeners have the same associations with disease. For diabetes, for menstrual irregularities and ability to ovulate, the PCBs that show the strong associations are those with few chlorines and no dioxin-like activity. And these are the more volatile congeners. Of the pesticides, only hexachlorobenzene had a weak association with diabetes, but it didn't have any with ovulation. And we suggest that inhalation is the important route of exposure that explains these associations. Now, I've been involved in a legal case that has major implications for inhalation as well. This is the case in which a husband and wife worked together in a plant that was recycling PCB oils or waste oils that might or might not contain PCBs. Both were told to smell the oils before testing them so they would know whether or not they contain PCBs. PCBs have a very distinctive smell. It's a subtle one, but anyone that works with them regularly can detect them. The man was diagnosed with thyroid cancer in 2003, and then later diagnosed with malignant melanoma in 2011. He was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2013, but he was not a smoker, and he died of brain metastasis from whatever. His wife, who actually was cleaning up the samples, but told to smell them as well, she also developed thyroid cancer, and she developed a compound melanocytic dysplasic nevus, which is the precursor to malignant melanoma. Now, it's very unusual for two people that are unrelated to develop these same cancers. The blood results are shown in the next slide, and they show clear evidence that both were exposed to excessive amounts of these lower chlorinated congeners. Look down first at PCB 153. The levels in both the man and the woman are very similar to the NHANES values. They're certainly less than 95th percentile level and not much more than the 50th percentile. But if you look at PCB 28 and PCB 52, both of which have lower chlorines, 3 and 4 chlorines, you see that their levels are enormously much elevated relative to the NHANES 50 and 95%. So this becomes very strong evidence that inhaled PCBs were absorbed by their bodies, and it becomes very likely that the inhaled PCBs caused these cancers. PCBs are rated by IARC as a known human carcinogen, and actually I was on that panel because of this legal case where we were demonstrating that PCBs cause these cancers. I had to be an invited expert rather than a full member of the panel. But this is very strong evidence that inhaled PCBs can cause cancer. Now, I want to go on and talk about a few other effects of PCBs that are relevant to inhaled PCBs, although the studies we did at the time, we hadn't understood how important inhalation was. So it's well known by many studies that exposure to PCBs reduces cognitive function and alters behavior. There's evidence that ADHD is increased on PCB exposure. So my colleagues and I have done these IQ tests on Mohawk adolescents, and we found that the higher the PCB levels, the less well these adolescents did on 4 cognitive tests. And again, we grouped PCBs in different ways. We weren't thinking, we didn't look to see the effects of these lower chlorinated congeners, but you see on a variety of tests, everything was negative. Not everything was statistically significant, but everything in this list, every test that was done by 4 different ways of accounting for the PCB levels showed a negative association. What about adults? Well, we tested 350 Mohawk adults with IQ and memory tests, We had their PCB blood levels. And what we found is that, again, the higher the PCB level, the poorer they did. Now, it was interesting here, there appeared to be maybe even a threshold below which there wasn't an effect, but clearly a dramatic reduction in performance on a grooved pegboard test with higher PCBs. This is a slide from an old study by Deborah Rice, where she gave PCBs to monkeys and then tested their ability to learn on a task, and you see that their ability to learn was dramatically reduced. My colleagues and I did an interesting study on rats. The rats were fed PCB contaminated fish, and then they were tested on a test where they had to earn their water by pressing a bar, but they could only be rewarded 2 minutes after the light came on. The black bars, the triangles at the bottom are the performance of the male and female rats that were the controls. What you see that they would learn this task and they would press the bar a little more frequently and then be awarded after 2 minutes. But the animals that had been, the rats that had been fed the contaminated fish pressed much more rapidly. And in fact, they would every now and then give these very rapid pulses, saying, damn it, give me the water. And this is certainly characteristic of what we see in children with ADHD. They're impatient. They don't deal well with frustration. And that is a concern. All right, let me talk a little bit about PCBs in schools. Because in terms of exposure in an indoor situation, the last thing you want is to have children exposed to something that would reduce their ability to learn. That's what you go to school for. Well, until 1972, PCBs were widely sold by Monsanto to be used in open products. That is, products that weren't enclosed like a transformer or a capacitor would be, but they were open in the air. They were used as a solvent for paint and caulk, as a floor sealant. They were used in copy paper. And in any of these sources, the PCBs are going to slowly volatilize. Now, another problem in many schools is that PCBs were used in ballast and fluorescent lights. These are basically little capacitors, but in many old buildings, those haven't been replaced, and because they heat, they leak. So there is a significant source of PCB exposure in many schools. PCBs were used as a solvent for caulk up until the late 1970s. The Department of Energy says 46% of all buildings in the US constructed up through 1979 contained PCB caulk. And the content is often very high. I analyzed some of the caulk on the window outside of my office right here. It was full of Aircore 1254 at concentrations over several hundred ppm. The caulk containing PCBs, unfortunately, the PCBs don't just stay in the caulk. They migrate into the masonry, and this makes it very difficult to remediate these buildings. Just some of the evidence of PCBs in schools. In German schools, teachers were found to have elevated levels of these lower chlorinated congeners. It was true in schools in Boston, schools in New York City. Schools in Hartford, Connecticut were actually closed because removing the caulk was more expensive than building a new school. And in Malibu, California, PCBs were also found in the schools. This is a slide I stole from Bob Herrick, who I gather is on the call. It's looking at teachers in schools that had PCB caulk versus teachers in schools that didn't. The red bars are, again, these are different PCB congeners. What you see on the left is that the teachers from the PCB schools have much higher PCB levels than those in the other group. But if you look on the far right, the concentrations are about the same. This is very reminiscent of what I showed you of the man and his wife that were recycling the PCB oils, indicating that the teachers are absorbing lower chlorinated PCBs almost certainly from the air. If the teachers are absorbing them, the students are as well. Now, what are the standards for PCBs in caulk? Well, there's a regulation that if you demonstrate more than 50 parts per million in caulk, you must have it removed. But there's nothing that says if you think it's more than that and you don't test it, then you don't have to remove it. So this is a real problem. Now, also EPA has no standard for PCBs in air, although it does have an advisory for schools of not having more than 100 nanograms per cubic meter for students ages 3 to 6 and more than 300 nanograms per cubic meter for older children. Real question as to whether those are protected standards. I certainly do not believe they are. The situation in New York City schools is telling. Schools tend to be old. There's never enough money. Some PCB concentrations in ballasts were as high as 670,000 ppm. And there's one story where drops of pure PCBs leaked directly on the head of a student during a class. In 4 pilot schools, in 150 rooms, they found caulk more than 50 parts per million, some as high as 440,000 parts per million. The Bloomberg administration resisted doing immediate remediation, but EPA pushed them, and so this has been, at least the ballasts have been removed. The caulk has not to date. In Malibu, a very interesting situation. Parents found soil samples with high PCBs, and they wondered where it came from. They found it was the caulk. They took measurements, and the PCBs were remediated in those rooms that were tested. But the school board refused to test any other rooms. Parents went and collected more caulk, and they were arrested for coming into school. So, you know, a major problem. Now, that situation has been somewhat further resolved. The question is, how large a problem is this? Well, most schools have not been tested, and most schools are not even aware of the issue. The cost of remediation can be very large, and it usually has to be borne by the local community. And it isn't just removing the caulk, it's masonry as well. But the issue is, this is not just schools. This is any older building, homes, offices, and most people are, first of all, unaware of the problem and wouldn't know what to do anyhow. So this is a slide from Herb Needleman focused on lead, but it applies to PCBs as well. There's a distribution of IQ in our population. There are a few gifted kids. There are a few that are less gifted. But if you have an exposure that reduces their cognitive function, you shift everybody down. Probably that doesn't mean that most people can't get a job and so forth. But you have many fewer gifted students, and you have many more that are barely able to survive in our society. So anything that causes a reduction in IQ is really enormous tragedy. And the last place you want to have exposure is a school. So in conclusion, exposure to PCBs is ubiquitous. We're all exposed to them. We all have them in our bodies. They're known to increase many diseases, including the chronic diseases like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer. But they also cause neurobehavioral effects and endocrine disruption. Certainly we are exposed to PCBs in food, and we should do what we can to reduce that. But inhalation may be a very important route of exposure. I don't mean to say it's more important than food, but I think the question certainly is out there. Our ecologic studies show that even just living near a PCB contaminated site increases your risk of developing these diseases. That must be because of inhalation. of the volatilization of PCBs in those contaminated sites. So it's really important to find ways of reducing the exposure. And that's my talk, and I really apologize for this echo that I'm sure still is there. Listing my collaborators from the New York State Department of Health, the University of Albany, collaborators at Aquasophony, and also at CDC ATSDR. Thank you very much for your attention.
Can we ask questions?
I'm a certificate.
Certainly. I'm ready to answer questions. I don't know where our hosts are.
Well,
And here's a question, because I know I'm going to have work on hopefully at the end of the month, and right, it actually is going to be past the expiration. So will, if and when they
Can you all hear me? Okay, so we're using, just because there was so much background noise when we tried to unmute all the attendees, we're going to go back to the chat box. So if you have a question for Dr. Carpenter, please use your chat box on the Zoom window. And if you're having trouble finding it, you might need to scroll down to the toolbar at the bottom, and you should see the option for chat, and that should open up the window for you that you can type into. So I have a question, David. Do you have recommendations for people that are interested in having the caulk at their local schools tested? Are there steps that can be taken?
Yeah, it's certainly important to have the caulk tested. However, the implications for what you're going to do about it after you find the results are difficult. Because again, once you test it, if you find more than 50 ppm, you're legally obligated to have it remediated. But ignorance is never a good thing. And so I certainly advocate people testing caulk in old buildings, especially in schools.
Okay, so we have a question. You made some very interesting correlations. Can you talk more about your evidence for causation, particularly from the inhalation pathway?
Well, you know, how do you prove causation? I think it's in general the case that in epidemiology and medicine, we never quite get to the point of proving causation. What we can show is consistency of evidence. You build a case from studies done with different outcomes, different individuals doing them. I think the indirect evidence is just very strong. The fact that the associations we see are strongest with the lower chlorinated congeners that are not so persistent and are more volatile applies across these diseases we've studied, where we've actually paid attention to these lower chlorinated congeners. That's cancer, diabetes. We haven't really done that as well with hypertension, but certainly with the menstrual irregularities in ovulation, we have that evidence. We certainly have evidence that PCBs volatilize. Most people don't even understand that that is the case, and that they can be absorbed through the lungs.
Have there been studies with animal models looking at inhalation and health effects?
Yes, there have. The ones I know best are ones that were done by my group, publication by Casey et al., where they actually compared ingestion and inhalation in a rat model. They found that inhalation was actually more effective, more absorption by air than by ingestion of food, and that they demonstrated alteration in thyroid function. I don't recall what else, but they had a number of both morphological changes and serum changes from the inhalation exposure.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Since PCBs are also in sewage sludge, and a lot of food is grown in sewage sludge, and commercial compost has sewage sludge, it seems that PCBs can be uptaken in the food.
Well, that's absolutely correct, that PCBs are taken into the food, and that most of the more highly chlorinated congeners we all have in our bodies almost certainly come from the PCBs we get in the food. Now, the degree to which PCBs are absorbed by plants, that's not a major source. The major source is the animal fat. It's interesting that commercial enterprises recycle waste animal fats. When a cow is butchered, the cow's fat is recycled into animal food. And that provides a mechanism of just recycling these fat-soluble compounds back into our food.
That's a very good point. Okay, thank you. The next question is, good afternoon, Dr. Carpenter. I've spoken with you in the past. This is Stacy. And you mentioned that Olestra may be able to help to remove PCBs from the body. Can you talk more about this? And is Olestra safe for the body? I've read that cholera may also bind to PCBs and help with elimination from the body. Do you know if this is true and how one can use it?
Well, Olestra is a non-absorbable lipid, so and it is commercially available. There are Olestra potato chips. It has been demonstrated in cases of severe PCB or dioxin poisoning that giving large amounts of Olestra can reduce the body burden. I think this was done in the presence of the president of Ukraine that was poisoned with dioxins, and there are other earlier reports of that. Now, one of the problems is that non-absorbable lipids cause violent diarrhea, and you lose all your fat-soluble vitamins. So it's not an easy way to reduce your PCB body burden. Some people now are taking Olestra for 5 days and then going off of it and supplementing their fat-soluble vitamins. But it is a way to have the PCBs move the other way across the gut. How wise it is for people to do this on their own is still a question. But in cases of very severe exposure, it clearly is a way to reduce levels.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Now a question from Michelle. I'm a teacher that had to leave a highly toxic school containing varichlor 1254, 1016, 1248, and 1242. Why do many of us have multiple chemical sensitivities, and why can't we touch anything from the school without having significant reactions?
Well, you're asking several questions there. The multiple chemical sensitivity is a disease that we don't understand very well. It certainly occurs in a number of people where they react negatively to many, many different chemicals. Those different commercial mixtures that you mentioned are simply products that Monsanto manufactured where the last two digits reflect the percentage of chlorine in that mixture. So 1242 is 42% chlorine, 1260 is 60% chlorine. But each of those still has a wide mixture of congeners. As I showed you with the blowing air across 1260, there are lower chlorinated congeners present, even though their percentage in the commercial mixture is not high.
Okay, thank you. And Robert Herrick put in chat that a good resource on PCB in schools is, and then he provided a link there for anyone who might be interested in that. And a question from Laura. Thank you for the presentation. Have your studies considered the potential that other variables outside of PCB inhalation, such as other contaminants in the area, income disparity, etc., that could also contribute or have an impact on these health effects that you discussed in your presentation?
Well, certainly that's absolutely correct, and one can never rule out everything. We're all exposed to so many different chemicals, and what we know about usually has been dependent on the development of the methods for measuring them. And the more we develop ability to detect chemicals, the more different chemicals we find. So I try always to be careful to, it goes back to the question on causation. We have a lot of evidence that supports the hypothesis that inhalation of PCBs is very dangerous and causes health hazards. Can I say with absolute confidence that it's not inhalation of some other chemical that migrates with the PCBs? No, I cannot. But I still have confidence that that inhalation is a very important route of exposure, and that PCBs likely are the significant contaminant that is responsible for the effects we see.
Great, thank you. Now, I think this may have to be our last question, but we have one from Brian Nickel at EPA. He says, you've talked a lot about PCBs and caulk, and to some extent light ballasts. My understanding is that PCBs were also used in paint during the same era in which it was used in caulk. It seems to me paint would be even more difficult to remediate since it's spread out over a large area. With this in mind, is caulk a bigger problem than paint?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't really know the answer because there hasn't been very much attention paid to paint. The measurements that we have are of caulk, and we find these extraordinary levels in the caulk. The paint, it may have volatilized more because you have a greater exposed area, but I certainly agree that there needs to be attention to old paint as well. Now, I suspect that paint has been covered over more frequently than caulk has been replaced or covered over, which again may have reduced the level of volatilization at this stage of the game. But an important point for which we have very little information.
Okay, great. So just before we go, I'll say that there's another resource that's been shared in the chat box by Victoria, and it's a poster and fact sheet on PCBs in schools. So you can check out that link too if you're interested. And thank you again so much for your time and for all the information you shared with us. It was a really fascinating talk. We will have the recording made available. It'll be on the NWTCC website and on our own website. I'm not sure exactly how long that's going to take, but we're going to email all the participants today and let them know once that's up. So thank you everyone for joining. And thank you especially Dr. Carpenter for the webinar.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Okay, bye.